And now our first participant in today's discussion, Denis Eliseevich, is joining us. So we are very pleased to welcome Denis. Denis, good morning. We're glad to see you, glad to hear you.
Good morning, good morning.
Hi, Denis. I want to say to Denis Manza, now we have two Denises. I know how to address everyone. Either the wrong time is written in our description or the wrong time is in the announcement. Please check. If that's the case, either Denis Eliseevich and Mikhail Svetov will be here in an hour or in 3 hours, but I think everything is written correctly. If I'm not mistaken, I want to remind you once again and emphasize that we are not holding a debate today because Denis Eliseevich and Mikhail Svetov are not opponents. And that's only because they are both libertarians. Not just because they are both decent people, intelligent people, interesting, but also because it would be hard to find. Yesterday I tried, Denis, I'll be honest with you, I tried to find where you and Misha Svetov have disagreements. I listened to you, I listened to Svetov, I listened to Svetov, I listened to you, and in the end, I didn't find anything. Yes, actually, I wasn't trying to bring you together so that you would argue even more here if you had ever argued before, but there's nothing like that. So I want to remind you once again that the only question I have for you before Misha Svetov arrives,
Here,
why do you think you are the kind of person who will answer anything? When we did a stream with you or with Misha Svetov every third time, when Svetov and Eliseevich, when Eliseevich and Svetov, why do you think your audience and Misha Svetov's audience wanted to see you together so much? I'm really curious. Honestly,
for your channel, it's more of a symbiosis of audiences, since on my channel and Svetov's, there aren't many such requests. But you have a symbiosis of audiences. You have Russians watching, Ukrainians, and the diaspora from both countries. Everything is mixed together, and people have that kind of demand. Besides that, let's say speakers or political figures, doesn't matter, let's call them speakers, those who are ready to answer all questions. Here it's not about whether it's honest or not, it's just about answering all the questions. But tell me.
please, you just said something interesting. You said, neither I nor Svetov will have such requests, but you at Radio Vera will. Because here we have the first, the second, and the third groups. Why do you think we have all of them? And is it good or bad, Denis? No.
It's definitely good. It's just a different format. Your format is about diversity of speakers and points of view. I still have a single channel format. Guests are rare, but it's a channel for promoting my personal agenda. You give different people the opportunity to speak, people with different views, ages, generations, audiences. That also plays a role. Everyone has their own age-related perspectives.
Why did I ask you about this? Because yesterday when Kirill Nabutov was here, well, you know who Kirill Nabutov is, right? Of course, he's definitely not a Trump supporter, but he was really trying to criticize Trump quite specifically. And he said this phrase, I don't understand. I meet a lot of people from the former Soviet Union, immigrants who speak Russian or Ukrainian. Well, he mostly spoke Russian, saying Trump supporters. I don't understand how these people can, said Kirill. People who left the former Soviet Union who wanted freedom. And from his point of view, Trump doesn't give freedom, but on the contrary, he's going to turn the republic into an empire, according to Kirill. So how can these people who supposedly fled from the same thing end up running headfirst into it again? That's the first thing. And the second, I was reading the comments then, Denis, where they wrote, I'll tell Denis about it tomorrow. To you, Eliseevich, like on your channel, they spoke badly about Trump, but I'm trying to put it politely. Are you really like that? And then there are different words. Do you allow that? What could that mean, Denis?
I don't know the person who spoke on your channel, and secondly, well, you know that I'm kind of a pro-Trump person.
Thank you.
Of course, I don't want to take on the role of a commentator like the one you're describing, or to become Trump's advocate or anything like that. It's just that we're on the same side of the barricades. If tomorrow it's not Trump who embodies these ideas at the highest level of the political arena, but someone else, I will support them. I support Trump. I've been consistent for a long time. I don't fuss, I don't run back and forth and so on. That's not the case.
So tell me, please, I don't know, Denis, did you write to Misha? Is he okay?
Yes, we're waiting.
You just said, I'm not fussing, I'm not running around. I have a position, let's say Trump is a mask, but when people write, for example, change shoes, change clothes. Now it's a buzzword, remembering Yulia Latinina, Misha Svetov, by the way. Well, I think that people, things change. It's been 4 years, the war is still going on, circumstances change, situations change. And I think that when a person has one position, it's actually cool when they change it. For example, they say, well, that's what I thought before, but isn't that okay? Depending on the circumstances, when your perspective on a situation changes or not.
I think anyone changes their point of view. As time passes, like you said, things come to light, circumstances change. But for myself, I make a clear distinction between changing my mind and not changing my mind. There are fundamental things. Now, if tomorrow Svetov becomes a communist or I become a communist and come out and start telling you all this, then that's changing sides. I've only ever been accused of this kind of thing once in the entire history of my public appearances. That was in the case with Zalozhny. I released a video, let me tell you, in the summer of 2020. Or was it 2023? I think it was 2023, maybe 2024. Maybe it was 2023, something like Zalozhny, run for president. And people thought that I believed in Zalozhny, yes, that I was promoting Zalozhny, but then Zalozhny started behaving in a certain way. And I thought, I'm not going to promote this person. And I started talking about Zalozhny in a different way. And some people thought that I changed my mind, but I wasn't a member of Zalozhny's team or anything like that. On the contrary, I was promoting him. The person disappointed me when he started making political statements, and I was shocked. I understood everything, but that doesn't mean I changed my position. I've been consistent since the very first day of my statements. I didn't make it public either, since it's impossible to prove. I don't have anything like that. Well, yes, Denis.
That's exactly what I meant. What you just gave as an example with Zalozhny, that's exactly what I wanted to say, and you just said it. I didn't just support Zalozhny, I promoted Zalozhny. When he started behaving differently, my opinion changed accordingly. Well, that's exactly it. Is that really flip-flopping? No, not at all.
It's Zalozhny who flip-flopped, not me.
Well, yes, but the position you had and that you were lobbying for and promoting, it still remains. So you just said, so to speak, that I'm a Trump supporter. Let's say I live in Canada and I participated in a stream a long time ago. Denis, and there I said, back during Trump's first term, I said that I would like us to have a president like that in Canada. So one of the guests, there were 4 of us, said, I won't be with that scum. On one show, he disconnected because of me. I was really surprised by that reaction. Well, I mean, this person lives in America, and by the way, he was recently on our radio show. He doesn't remember, but I remember how he insulted me. Of course, I'll be honest with you, I haven't been called names like that very often, but that's how it was back then. He was so worked up, so on edge that he said, I won't be on the same show with her, no way, and just disconnected. That's why I think that if you have arguments, they should be put on the table. And if you don't, just disconnecting like that, well, I think that's very childish. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
I'll tell you even more now. Let me tell you something. I don't even remember if I've ever told this on air anywhere. Thank you. I have a copy of a document, a criminal case about a person in Ukraine in which I mentioned, not as a suspect or anything, but I'm mentioned. And it says that I have pro-Russian views because I support President Trump. You know, this was in 2023. The date on this document is 2023.
Wait, hold on. Sorry. You have pro-Russian views because you support...
According to some security service of Ukraine, Lieutenant Colonel or someone like that, that was his opinion in 2023 today. President Trump is holding peace negotiations. There's an 800 billion fund. These are still seen as pro-Russian views. I'm just saying this so people, especially in the diaspora, understand the schizophrenia in Ukraine today.
That's an interesting story you told.
I just can't publish this because it's material from a criminal case. I would just set that person up, but when I saw it, I was just shocked.
But you just said you can't do it because these are documents and you would set someone up. So that means for you, for Denis Eliseevich, setting someone up doesn't work. You don't accept that. Did I understand the situation correctly?
No, well, I haven't been involved in things like that. You know, I actually suffer more from being principled than from any kind of setups. So again, about Trump, you know how I started my channel? There's a laptop in the kitchen and I'm broadcasting from there. And that was 2022, the beginning of the war. And even then I was already supporting Trump, talking about Trump, and I was already getting hate for it. Can you believe it? I was in Kiev, so much time has gone by, and all these years I've supported him. When Gordon was doing broadcasts with Shvets, they were saying such nonsense. I was mocking all of it and holding this position for years. What do we see today when it's clear? You've probably heard Newsmax channel is coming to Ukraine and they're going to broadcast in English. Is this your favorite channel? Yes, yes, yes. It will be in Ukraine in the spring. And some people are already switching to being Trump supporters. They didn't say a word. At best, they didn't speak out against Trump. They just stayed silent out of fear, said nothing. But now you could say the elections are in the air. It's the market situation and they need to find a way in somewhere. And that's what makes me laugh. Now, I think so-called libertarians will start to appear. Well, in general, I find all of this very funny, but I've always said, and I have people here, to go there to America. I just communicate in that format. I talk to those I talk to. But I definitely don't want to sneak into politics through the back door.
Through the back door?
Yeah.
That's an interesting phrase. It's new to me. As I understand it, I don't know if Misha Svetov is joining us. Misha is responding to our messages. No, well, not yet, because I'm also texting him, and well, nothing so far. We talked about it yesterday.
I got confused. I just saw in my Vex feed that he posted about a stream in a few hours. I just didn't match up the time.
Denis, I'm going to ask our Denis. Denis, can you check? Because someone also wrote to us in the chat that the time is listed incorrectly.
No, it can't be listed incorrectly because our stream started exactly at the time we actually planned. Thank you.
No, I mean, Mikhail, maybe you misunderstood. That's what I meant.
Yes, I understand. No, well, usually, Mikhail.
He joins a little later. I mean, around 8:20. Okay, we'll wait, I think.
That he'll show up now.
Then I don't want to announce in advance the questions that were sent for you and Mikhail, Denis. The only thing I can tell you is that I've wanted to talk about this topic for a long time, especially what you just said, and your example of the situation. If you're a Trump supporter, does that mean you're pro-Russian? Well, it's kind of strange. I'll just say one thing. Only Trump is capable of stopping the war, said Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiga in an interview. In some interview, when we were naming our discussion today, it was, who doesn't want peace? Yes, I think that's right. Denis, am I saying it correctly?
Yes.
So when Sybiga said that only Trump is capable of stopping the war, what does that mean? Yes.
It just means they're going along with Trump. Zelensky is basically doing the same thing. He keeps repeating that Putin is only afraid of Trump. Putin is only afraid of Trump. He's not afraid of Europe. So Trump has to show him who's boss and so on. It's a pretty primitive move. In reality, they all despise Trump. They hate him. And I don't even want to say thank you anymore.
And this dislike, this hatred toward the American president, and at the same time, well, what they say and believe that only Trump can stop him or not. How can you put this puzzle together? Denis, on one hand, there's hatred, and on the other hand, there's hope.
Thank you. Well, it's Zugzwang, like in chess. There's no way out. No, there are no good moves. Any next move will lead to defeat. So they're trying to somehow choose the least defeat for themselves, probably. Well, that's absolutely certain. So you don't think anyone there respects Trump? That's it. Trump has mixed up all their cards. If Kamala had won, then today there would still be some arms supplies and the fueling of the war. The Democrats would have pushed to lower the mobilization age. They were already doing so then. Blinken came to Kiev, played guitar there in some pubs, and then said, let's send 20-year-olds to the front. I mean, it's all terrible.
Let's talk a bit about Ukraine then before Misha Svetov shows up.
That's it.
That only Trump is capable of stopping the war and so on. Sybiga emphasized that out of the 20 points of the peace plan, only a few unresolved issues remain, which concern control over the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant and the presence of the armed forces of Ukraine in the Donetsk region. And if only Donald Trump is capable of stopping the war, does that mean that diplomacy doesn't work at all without him?
Of course, diplomacy doesn't work. Moreover, you see, it's not classical diplomacy. It's not classical diplomats who are working, and they're definitely not professional diplomats. Professionals have tried, including from the Russian side as well, This is not just an indication of how complicated the current situation is. I think the world has changed so much that classical diplomacy basically doesn't work anymore. The world has changed that much. I believe this relates to the information and technology revolution.
By the way, Misha Svetov wrote that he really mixed up the time a little. He'll be here soon. Why is the so-called 20-point peace plan almost ready now, but the war is still going on? Denis?
Because there is no agreement on the points you mentioned. I confirm that's absolutely true, especially, well, regarding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, things aren't as strict there. But regarding the withdrawal from Donbass, Zelensky is ready to withdraw if Ukraine is accepted into the European Union in any format.
All right, please tell me, who exactly is blocking the remaining points, these remaining ones, Russia, Ukraine, or the Allies?
No, Russia can't block them, even if I'd like to blame Russia, because these are its own demands, first and foremost. That's why the conversation is focused on Zelensky. He wants to run for another presidential term. Have you heard about this? Lavrov said that Trump is supposedly violating the agreements in Anchorage, not putting enough pressure on Ukraine. In reality, it's not about not putting enough pressure on Ukraine, but not putting enough pressure personally on Zelensky. Because Trump and Putin have come to, how should I put it, an agreement that Zelensky needs to be completely removed from the stage in any way, in any format.
Well, okay, tell me, if Trump is the key to peace, well, if that's the case, what will happen if he doesn't win the election?
Thank you. In the midterms,
Well, yes.
well, it will be very bad for everyone, I think. It will be very bad for everyone. And that's one of the reasons why Zelensky is delaying, because Trump is, let's say, free for these matters until June. And from June on, he'll be fully focused on domestic affairs and the midterm elections. And if it's before June, then what did Zelensky say? If we don't reach an agreement before June, as he hopes, the situation will be extremely grim. There's a catastrophe in Ukraine right now, and I don't know what will happen next. My family lives there. I know the situation with electricity. Well, for the last 5-6 days, they've been turning on the power for only 2-3 hours a day. I did a stream the day before yesterday on Sunday, and I asked people in the chat to write which city they live in and what the situation with electricity is. I understood what the situation is like across the whole country. Right away, the Financial Times writes that Ukraine has suffered such energy losses. Well, the energy infrastructure is destroyed and there are no missiles for the Patriot air defense system. What kind of war continuation are we talking about? The ice?
Did you say something about Lavrov? They wrote right away, I lost you. I want to ask you again about the slowdown. I don't know if you'll ever come about the slowdown. Telegram, Denis is probably already aware, and you probably know too.
Let's wait for Mikhail, since this involves him.
We're already getting into the topic of our discussion today, especially now about the negotiations, especially the latest ones. Actually, there are a lot of nuances there that I think we'll discuss.
We'll discuss it.
Yes.
It's worth talking about because from the point of view of an ordinary person listening to all this, I come to the conclusion that the war is still going on. Zelensky is to blame because he absolutely doesn't want to end it, while everyone else is in favor and offers him this, and this. But Zelensky just absolutely refuses, that's all. To be honest, I don't completely agree with that, especially after the recent negotiations. By the way, what Mr. Lavrov was talking about is the same thing. So, well, I think yes, and now Mikhail is joining us. So let's first welcome our next participant in today's discussion, Mikhail Svetov. Mikhail, glad to see you, glad to hear you. Thank you for joining us.
Likewise, Denis, Alexandra, and Denis, I apologize for joining late. For some reason, I went to your channel and it said the broadcast would start in 3 hours. I set a reminder for 3 hours later, but it went off after only 1 hour. I don't know what happened, but anyway, I'm here.
You know, Mish, hi. We'll check that because I saw the same thing in the chat. Someone wrote about it. I looked at the description and it seems to be correct. Anyway, well, it happens. It's not clear how it happened. Anyway, that's not what I meant.
That I didn't forget, and I want to apologize to everyone.
These are our mistakes and we will fix them. Hi, Misha, Denis, hi, and I'm very happy to see both of you here on our channel. And I want to, Misha, I already asked you this question, Denis. Now I'll ask you, Denis answered. I didn't expect that answer. It really, so to speak, impressed me. When we have streams with Denis or with you, the audience writes, well, if not every third, then every fifth message. When Eliseevich and Svetov, when Svetov and Eliseevich, I want to ask you, you didn't hear what Denis answered, did you? That's why I want to ask, why did people want to see you together so much?
Really? Denis joined my channel for a joint broadcast about 2 or 3 years ago at the start of the war. And in general, I think the broadcast was quite successful, and I think people wanted to see us because we're both libertarians. I'm from Russia and Denis is from Ukraine. And people are interested in seeing our perspective on what's happening, considering that we are citizens of countries that unfortunately, and I think it's a mutual regret, are at war with each other. And it's a war in which many of our friends are dying on both sides of the border. That's why I think it's a completely understandable reason why people wanted to see us together.
But let me tell you what I thought. Usually people want to bring together those who don't really get along with each other, so that there would be some kind of argument, some kind of quarrel. And I started listening to your streams, listening to Denis. Well, contradictions, to find some nonsense where you two, well, I didn't find anything.
Well, my subscribers told me, and Denis himself also told me in a private message that he has some kind of complaint against me. In connection with the broadcast I had with Sobchak, and I promised him to respond to any complaints, including in a joint broadcast either on his channel or on mine, but apparently I will be responding on your channel.
And Denis knows, and so do you.
I take any criticism quite calmly and I can respond to it.
When I was talking just now and couldn't find it, I remembered. Do you remember that funny cartoon, The Guys with the Crow? I couldn't do it. Well, I just couldn't find anything. So when I asked Denis why people wanted you two together so much, Denis said he thinks it's because you have your own audience and Denis has his own audience. And here we have everyone, people from all different groups come here. So those others, the second and third groups, they think in their own way, so to speak. And that's why they specifically demanded it from us, not from you, not from Denis, but specifically on Radio Vera. Did I say what you meant correctly, Denis?
Well, yes, it's a symbiosis of the audience. A symbiosis of the audience.
A symbiosis of the audience. I asked Denis if it's good or bad. He said, I think politely. Denis said, I think it's good. I want to ask you, is it good or bad? If that's the case, thank you.
Yes, of course, it's wonderful. I told Denis directly as well that I have absolutely no complaints or any resentment towards him. So I'm glad this broadcast happened. Maybe it won't be the last one. Let's see how our conversation goes.
Denis, do you have any complaints about Mishka? And then we'll move on to the topic of the war. Who wants it and who doesn't?
No complaints. That's too strong. I really have none. It's just that some points escape me now since the interview with Sobchak wasn't recent. There's so much information, and since Mikhail also works with it like I do, everything gets mixed up. I just got a general impression as if, well, let's put it this way, Putin isn't such a bad guy, but that might be my subjective impression.
No, that's possible. I don't know if you've read my article about the mercy of power, which is actually dedicated to Putin, and the conclusion there is completely different. The conclusion there was that in a situation where power is so strongly usurped, in a situation where there are no institutions at all, the only thing a person can hope for is that the authorities will be merciful to them, because in such a situation, a person has no tools to protect themselves. And this phrase, the mercy of power, the mercy of Putin, is taken out of context and is spreading across the internet. And people in general present my point as exactly the opposite of what I wanted to say, what I am saying, and what I continue to say. And on the Vera radio channel, we actually discussed this text of mine in quite some detail. So I have no illusions, no additional sympathy for Vladimir Putin has appeared during this time. I have actually developed, and rightfully so, much more antagonism. Although I have always been skeptical of the West, especially the European Union, over the past few years, my attitude toward the European Union has probably reached the point of disgust. Because, well, honestly, these are incompetent people. These are malicious people, often malicious not only toward Russia, but also toward Ukraine and even toward their own society. And it's disgusting for me to watch this. And first and foremost, it's disgusting to watch. Because against their background, Putin really starts to be seen, especially not from inside Russia, but from the outside, as not the worst alternative. Although between Putin and the average European leader, in general, the difference is actually just cosmetic. We see that now the internet is being introduced by passport. These initiatives are happening simultaneously in several European countries and Western nations like Australia, the United Kingdom, Spain, Germany, and France. We also see the persecution of Telegram at first. Pavel Durov was arrested in France, and now it's Elon Musk's Twitter. There was also a search in France. And all of this, of course, reminds me of Putinism in 2019. Some might say that those were herbivorous times compared to 2026, and indeed those times were softer, but we know where this leads. And we also understand that the persecution of the same Twitter, the same Telegram, has nothing to do with protecting children's interests or defending any kind of moral image. This is classic political censorship, which targets the platforms where the opposition finds a place for itself, where it can perhaps be heard. So I haven't developed any additional sympathy for Vladimir Putin. I just also realize that people who are in Russia today basically can no longer count on a fair trial, nor can they count on any protection from human rights organizations. The only thing they can't count on, unfortunately, I must say, is the mercy of Vladimir Putin, who frankly very rarely shows it. That's my detailed answer. Thank you very much.
All right, Denis, if you have something to add, Denis Eliseevich, I see you as Denis Eliseevich, Denis Mazar. I'm not sure who I'm addressing, Denis Eliseevich. If you have any comments for Misha, and then we'll get back to the topic at hand.
No, I make that analogy as well. Regarding Putin and the current actions of the leaders of the European Union, I don't want to generalize or speak badly about the entire European Union. There are still a few countries with more or less decent leaders, but the leaders of the entire European Union, I mean Ursula, Macron, Merz, and especially Sanchez, this is definitely terrible. And I also wrote posts in English on X. It really reminds me of Putinism. The bright beginning was set in Romania during the elections. I'm sure that if Sandu hadn't won in Moldova by just a couple of percentage points, it would have been exactly the same. They wouldn't have let another candidate come to power, and I say this without sympathy for them. For instance, Congress's commission just finished its work and reached a conclusion. We don't see any, let's say, pro-Russian markers on that candidate in Romania who was removed from the elections, meaning we can't prove that he was pro-Russian. I somehow trust the American Congress more than Ursula in Brussels.
Continuation. Well, you see, Denis and I basically have very similar positions. I also feel much more sympathy toward the United States than toward Europe. The only thing is, of course, I would start counting not from the events that happened in Romania, but much earlier. Well, at the very least, yes, from the beginning of the persecution of Telegram. Well, yes, let's start from the beginning of the persecution of Telegram, the arrest of Pavel Durov in France, actually even earlier. But let's start from there.
Mish, you should see what they've already written to us here, that you two are pro-Russian and so on and so forth. The rhetoric escalates, claiming you're both from the same camp. Spies, bandits, provocateurs, whatever. I'm actually softening it now, Mish. I'm picking the nicest words they're using here, really wonderful ones. Denis, what did you call out audience today? Please say it again. Symbiosis.
Symbiosis.
This symbiosis is working today. Denis Montar, go to the sheets and then I'll continue.
Yes, well, actually, it would seem that we chose a rather simple topic. I mean, the topic of the question, who in fact does not want peace? If you ask anyone, probably everyone will think you're crazy and say that, of course, everyone wants peace. Yes, everyone wants peace. Everyone wants the war to end. No one wants to fight at all. And of course, no one wants any deaths or anything like that. But lately, this rhetoric, who actually doesn't want this and who talks about it more, has somehow been getting stronger. That's why we decided to discuss this topic a little bit today. And especially in light of the recent, so to speak, negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And also the interview with Mr. Lavrov, which literally took place the day before, and his rhetoric as well. So I wanted to ask this question specifically to Mikhail, and then, of course, Denis will comment on it as well, so that both of our participants can hear what we're talking about. So, Mikhail, what do you think, based on the latest information, who is it after all? Yes, is it possible to answer this question definitively? Who doesn't want to?
Well, actually, unfortunately, you can, because it's easier to answer the question of who wants peace. Donald Trump wants peace, the Russian people want peace, and the Ukrainian people want peace. But those who don't want peace are, accordingly, the European politicians. Of course, the Kremlin and part of the Ukrainian establishment are also interested in making it continue. Because the people who pay the price for this war are not at all the ones who profit from it. And we can see this even in Zelensky's closest circle, it would seem. How is this even possible? During a war that your government presents as existential, as a war for survival, is it really possible to steal military and humanitarian aid provided by the United States and Western countries? I just can't wrap my head around it. And of course, for these people in Ukraine, it's beneficial for the war to continue. They've made a lot of money from this war and want it to go on. Of course, I can say the same thing about Russia as well. Obviously, Vladimir Putin wants war, otherwise he wouldn't have started it. Clearly, there are people in his inner circle who are also making money from this war. And just from talking to my friends in Ukraine, from talking to my friends in Russia, I know that despite these 4 monstrous, bloody, deadly years, there is no real antagonism between the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. And this is literally a war that nobody wants except the Russian, Ukrainian, and European elites. European elites want the war to continue because it helps solve their problems. A huge number of their own internal issues are being distracted from by the European elites with this war, the scandal with COVID, which faded into history only because Vladimir Putin started this war, and the immigration crisis. And accordingly, they try to exaggerate things in order to avoid solving some internal problems. That's why, unfortunately, there are a huge number of people interested in this war continuing, and these are very influential people. The only ones not interested in the war are our peoples. And thank you that such a person as Donald Trump has appeared, who is really making objective, real efforts to put an end to this war. I hope Donald Trump succeeds.
Well, here are questions, of course, about the arguments. Where actually are the arguments in favor of that? In particular, there's a question about where are the arguments that the Kremlin doesn't want peace? Well, I would also add where are the arguments, so to speak, yeah. Since we're already talking about this, that Ukraine doesn't want peace, I mean, as you said, partly the Ukrainian establishment.
Because the Kremlin is putting forward conditions that are different from peace at the point of contact. I've defended this position since the war began, once I saw where things were heading. The best thing both our peoples can hope for is that the war ends as soon as possible at the point of contact, and all other issues will be resolved through diplomatic means. The Kremlin has repeatedly made it clear that such conditions do not suit it. The Kremlin insists on the surrender of territories that have not yet been captured by military means and presents an ultimatum to the United States, Ukraine, and the rest of the world. If these territories are not surrendered through negotiations and not by military means, then the war will continue until these territories are occupied by military force. In my opinion, this is quite sufficient evidence to claim that the Kremlin does not want the war to end.
Denis, do you have any objections or additions?
I can only answer the same question. Let's do it.
Of course, please.
I also believe that neither Volodymyr Zelensky nor Vladimir Putin wants peace. But there is one big but. Putin is now in a position of strength, in the position of a country that is advancing and winning. Objectively, it's much easier for Putin to present everything that's happening or how it will end in victory to his people than it is for Zelensky. Putin is fighting with his own people, with his own money, with his own weapons. Yes, of course, with China's help, but it's not the same as Ukraine, which unfortunately has to ask for everything and basically has nothing of its own. That's why neither of them wants to end it. But it's much easier for Putin to finish it than for Zelensky. If Putin ends this war, he doesn't lose power. If Zelensky ends this war, he loses power. These are the main arguments. I don't want to be Putin's advocate in any way, but I know the internal affairs in Ukraine very well. And honestly, Mikhail, I'm more interested in Russia than Ukraine, which makes sense. The same goes for being more interested in Ukraine than Russia.
And
besides everything else, I know very well what's going on. Who benefits from what, who doesn't benefit, and it's absolutely clear that it's not beneficial for Zelensky and his circle. When the war ends, Putin will definitely have all or almost all sanctions lifted, and gradually there will be economic cooperation with the United States. Of course, not 12 trillion as they claim there, that's ridiculous. 6 times the size of Russia's gross domestic product. Most likely they're talking about mineral resources, but that's a separate topic for discussion. If you want, we can discuss it, but Zelensky just doesn't have any of that. And if he's allowed to run in the elections, he'll have to go to the elections, and then all sorts of things will come out and be revealed. These are entirely different situations.
But if we go back to the last round of negotiations, where there were talks about recognizing the territory of Donbass as de jure Russian, meaning not in fact, but legally. And then there was the latest interview with Mr. Lavrov, who kept talking about the agreement in Anchorage, which the Americans no longer wanted to honor. What kind of agreements are these? I have a question for Denis and Mikhail.
As well. Should I answer first? Yes.
Yes, please, of course.
Regarding the agreement in Anchorage, it's about removing Volodymyr Zelensky from power. There are different ways to implement, so to speak, this desire. And indeed, there was such an agreement. And Russia is dissatisfied that Trump is not pushing hard enough or fast enough to resolve this issue. Trump has his own strategy for this, and Trump cannot put pressure on Zelensky the way he should right now, not even the way I would like. Because automatically, in the eyes of the world community, he would appear to be taking Putin's side, as if he's helping Putin. That's why Trump is acting wisely. He's calmly observing the situation, watching certain moments. Some decisions have already been made behind the scenes. I've already told you about the very tough conversation at Mar-a-Lago with, how should I put it, eyewitness accounts that there was a very tough conversation with Zelensky at Mar-a-Lago. That's not what happened at the press conferences. That's what you mean.
That this was the last conversation?
Yes. As for recognition, did you mean recognizing Donbass as Russian or Crimea or both? Who should recognize it?
Officially, the international community, as it was said, yes, meaning the world should recognize Donbass as fully Russian and recognize it legally.
So the point was that the United States should legally recognize the territories we lost, the ones Putin annexed. Ukraine doesn't have to recognize anything, and this issue is not on the agenda.
And that was exactly the agreement in Anchorage. I mean, the de jure recognition of the territory.
Part of the agreement, the concept of the agreement, is that Ukraine withdraws from Donbass. The issue of the armed forces remains debatable, and Zelensky is removed from power, and he can no longer run for election. This is the basis.
Got it, thanks. Denis, Mikhail, do you have anything to say?
Yes, I agree with Denis again, except for the moment where he says Vladimir Putin. Yes, of course, he is in a much more advantageous position regarding Ukraine and can dictate his terms. But we also shouldn't underestimate the price of war that Vladimir Putin is paying on all other fronts. We've talked about this in detail on Radio Vera more than once. Namely, in general, the geopolitical influence of Russia, the Kremlin, and Vladimir Putin himself. Over these 4 years, it has shrunk to that of a regional power. But the ambitions were much greater, and the claim was that Russia is a player, even in Africa. Thanks to Chivaka Wagner, that was really the case, and in some countries they even kicked out the French. Thanks to supporting military coups, the Kremlin declared itself a player in the Middle East. Accordingly, the Syrian regime, Assad's regime, was supported by the Kremlin. Because of this, the only Russian military base in the Middle East appeared. The Kremlin also declared itself a player in Latin America through Venezuela and Cuba. Historically, this is understandable, and year after year, Vladimir Putin has been losing all of this. That is, the cost of the war is, of course, enormous, and the White House, the United States, they find pressure points, they find ways to take advantage of this weakness of the Kremlin in order to accordingly put pressure on the Kremlin. Including the arrest of Maduro in this regard was quite telling, and the threats, of course, to resolve the Cuba issue are also primarily directed not at the Castro clan, but first and foremost at the Kremlin, because Cuba, it is already perceived as a country that is forever locked in Russia's sphere of influence. But today, Russia has no tools to protect it within its sphere of influence. As we can see, Russia can't even protect its own tankers that sail in international waters today, and if the White House wanted to, of course, the issue of Cuba could be resolved very easily. That is, the price the Kremlin pays for the war and the pressure that Trump puts on Vladimir Putin are absolutely real. It's just that it looks very different from the pressure on Vladimir Zelensky, who simply isn't present here. I completely agree with Denis. He is not an independent player because he doesn't control his own resources. That is, the whole game that Zelensky is playing is a game on credit at someone else's expense. And again, relying solely on the mercy of European politicians and the mercy of the United States, the countries that support him. This is a very shaky role, the role of Vladimir Putin, but of course it's much more solid. Putin is independent, unlike Zelensky. He's a player in his own right.
I want to ask you guys, both Denis and Misha. Misha, when we were talking with Denis before you joined us, we discussed, and it was also mentioned in the comments, that only Trump can stop the war today. And when you were talking about who wants war and who doesn't, you mentioned the establishment in Europe, the Kremlin and Ukraine, and you said it and you did it. That definition at the end, I hadn't known before, I hadn't heard it, and it's strange to me that it didn't occur to me. Or to the people who are listening to you today, or to Denis Eliseevich, when you said that it's not the people who want war, and as for the establishment, the people and Trump, that's how you said it, that's what was written. Do you and Denis really not understand, and especially you, did you get hit with this? Only Putin is capable of reconciling the two peoples who were set against each other by the Anglo-Saxons. That you are not?
Well, the English too, yes, at least the English political class is definitely interested in making sure the war continues. And Boris Johnson's role in those negotiations in Istanbul, well, it's well known to everyone, and it's completely destructive because of him. Not least because of him, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people have died since then. So no, I did mention the United Kingdom as well, or rather the British political class as a party interested in continuing the war. But to make peace, I honestly feel maybe I'm in some kind of bubble. But I still have many friends in Ukraine, including people who are fighting as volunteers. They went to war, and I still have good human relationships with them because we understand that we ended up in this situation not by our own will. We were literally dragged into this situation by politicians. That's why I don't feel that this hatred between our peoples is real. But of course, I also realize that there are people who have gone through such terrible events that on an emotional level, it will probably be difficult for them to overcome this in the future. But considering that this was discussed at the very beginning of the war, now it seems to have been forgotten. Yes, but let's still remind ourselves that even after the bloody tragedy of World War II, relations with Germany and the Germans became absolutely neighborly. All European countries, and today Israel and Germany, are closest allies and friends. Therefore, we shouldn't overestimate the power of trauma either. It seems to me, or at least I want to hope, that there is no real antagonism between our peoples today, and as soon as the politicians change, all this horror will become history.
Denis, do you think so too?
And also this point that Mikhail mentioned about personal emotional trauma. When I discuss this point on my channel, I always make a remark that I don't address it at all. I don't touch people who've experienced these horrors. I know some, and I won't tell them world history has seen worse. Drawing this analogy with Hitler, it's just not something you should do, but we all understand how it was. At least I hope so, but for that, a completely different leader needs to come to power in Russia, just to at least start this process. And of course, this isn't a matter of 1, 2, or 3 years. It's probably a matter of decades, and definitely with a different government.
And tell me, please, yes.
I agree. Until the government changes, this hatred will keep being fueled simply because this hatred is part of the foundation, that is the system that is built right now. This is a tragedy, a misfortune for our peoples, for my people, but I hope we will get through this.
Yes, sorry, Denis. Yes, Denis.
I want to. So you, Mikhail, right? You asked a question based on comments that people wrote. How many people can Putin reconcile? I don't want to say the words I used to describe these people, including on air, but this person sees the overall humanitarian situation in Ukraine, particularly in Kyiv. So when he says that, that's Putin reconciling, right? When he attacks energy infrastructure, people freeze to death.
Denis, do you know how they'll respond to you?
And in Belgorod, we constantly deal with this. And in Belgorod, people there are also sitting without electricity and water.
Zelensky's government allows and has allowed military mistakes and in many cases has engaged in provocations and actions. I understand this well, but we are the ones defending ourselves. We were attacked. We didn't attack anyone, and that's crucial. Anyone who writes that is clearly out of their mind.
Here I'll add to what Denis said, that the trauma will really be on both sides of the border. And people who are experiencing blackouts and attacks in the Belgorod region, they also have a certain amount of hatred and emotional trauma. It will build up. And of course, these people will need help coping with this. But the number of people who have suffered from bombings, who have lost loved ones and consequently their homes, and who have witnessed the horrors of war on the Ukrainian side, there are objectively more such people today. Simply because part of the territory was destroyed, part of the territory was shelled, indeed due to the sheer power of the Kremlin's army. They are much more terrifying and often cause much greater damage than the real damage that is happening in the Belgorod region. So here, unlike Denis, I'm not reasoning as a defending country or an attacking country. Because I just see a conflict of interest between the ruling class and society. But purely in terms of numbers, yes, of course. People in Russia have suffered from this war, but the civilian population has suffered less than the civilian population in Ukraine. That's objectively true, isn't it?
And here's an interesting question, again, just on a basic level. Who should be held responsible for all of this? In the end, who will be held responsible for this huge list of things?
The list is huge.
I wanted to say that the list is huge, but Misha, I want to.
But as for the top names, these are the first ones, the ones who should be on this list.
Well, Vladimir Putin is responsible and guilty for the war, but you also have to realize that history is often written by the victors, not necessarily by justice, if you will. And there are no resources to judge Vladimir Putin for this, and the people who claimed moral authority to judge him, well, in my opinion, in recent years, they have experienced an extreme moral bankruptcy. And in general, by talking about collective responsibility and guilt, they have completely discredited the very possibility itself and helped Vladimir Putin unite the people around him. Thus,
Of course, I want to disagree with you on one point, not exactly disagree, but, well, I'm glad to discuss it with you. One moment that you mentioned when Denis was speaking, Denis Eliseevich, and when the question was asked about reconciling the peoples, yes, you gave the example of Germany and Israel. How many years have passed since the war? I mean, the Great Patriotic War. How many already? It ended in 1945. So,
well, more than 70 years.
yes, have passed. I'm telling you this now as a Jewish woman who relates to the topic of the Holocaust and to the topic of Jewish identity. It's clear, just like you said today. It makes sense that Denis is more focused on the topic of Denis Eliseevich and Ukraine. You're focused on Russia, and I'm focused on Israel, which also makes sense. And a tremendous amount of time has passed, a tremendous amount when Jews, in my opinion, not all of them, but those who went to live in Germany, started to feel differently. When this program started, when Jews from the Soviet Union were leaving for Germany, well, there was such an opportunity, and I know how much time it took for this to be implemented. Yes, so I'm talking now not only about Israel and Germany, but about all Jews in Germany. Yes, after the Holocaust and after children, elderly people, and women were burned in gas chambers. And let me tell you my first impression from my trip to Germany when I arrived there. Germany is beautiful and well kept. And so I was traveling by train from one city to another. I admired those lawns and little doll-like houses. My father was in a concentration camp once, and I thought, I wonder, was it here where it happened? I think that only recently, that noise is really distracting. Now it's gone, and only recently, maybe in the last few years. As for me and people like me, there are many people who can come to Germany today and hear the German language. Because the first time already in the 90s or 2000s when I heard it, I would cover my ears like this. Because I had seen all those scary movies about the Great Patriotic War, and I am already part of a generation that doesn't know war. And yet it took a colossal amount of time for that to somehow, how much time will it take today? Well,
I hope less, because despite all the horrors of the current war, it's still not as terrible as World War II, the Great Patriotic War. But the feeling you're describing, I'm sure Denis knows it, I know it too because of my family. They lived through the revolution, the Soviet Bolshevik Revolution, as a result of which many of my relatives and loved ones were killed, as a result of which a huge amount of property was lost, and you can now go and see the place where it used to be. This belonged to my great-great-great-grandfather, and Denis also went through this tragedy, and at the same time, it's impossible today to hate the people who were involved in this. I mean, not the communists. The communists should be hated because they are communists here and now, and they threaten us with all the same things. I mean, the people who were involved in collectivization, who often worked in certain government agencies, they had children who themselves reconsidered all the horrors of history and today are working to make sure this never happens again. Children are not responsible for their parents' actions. This applies to German, Jewish, Palestinian, Russian, Ukrainian, and all children. And yes, this new generation always allows us to turn the page and start living anew. So the feeling you describe is very familiar to me. I'm sure Denis knows it too, and it's a feeling that's valuable and important as a memory. Because we must not forget the mistakes of the past, but it shouldn't fuel hatred, because if it does, we'll just keep reliving those mistakes over and over again.
I can't disagree, Denis. What do you think about this?
Yes, I want to add something here, but not now, and I'm not suggesting anyone else do it either. Measuring the horrors of war. Like, for example, World War II is a 9 or 10 out of 10, and in Ukraine it's a 7. That would be sacrilegious, and the horrors in both cases are terrible. But there is one thing, but I want to say this. This is important as a Ukrainian citizen and someone who was there at the war's start. The feeling in society when I was leaving, it wasn't there yet, but now it's already happening. I left 8 months after the war began. I was forced to. Look, when you speak, Alexander, you understand that this topic isn't foreign to me either, the one you're talking about. Of course, the German language and Jews is still a bit different because in Ukraine, half the population speaks Russian. And now there are people who themselves were Russian-speaking Ukrainians before the war. And now, well, I understand that they say they find the Russian language repulsive. Either they fell for propaganda or something went wrong here. Of course, let's direct this towards Putin, his inner circle, the war criminals, the Russian army. But let's not use this to further fuel universal hatred. Are there specific names of those who are guilty? I've always said I don't like the expression good Russian or the idea of lumping everyone together. Today I see in Ukraine how a whole nation can be driven. I'm sure in Russia, by my estimate, Mikhail Mikhailovich can share his own if he wants. 20–30% of Russia's population are completely reasonable people, but they're totally suppressed by the dictatorship. It's the same in Ukraine. Do you think people love Zelensky? If something were to happen there today, I don't want to say what, but the dictatorship, the martial law holds people back. And when the whole country is under pressure from the security services, you can't do anything, no matter who you are. There, the bold and unruly, like Vysotsky said, of course, there are few of them, but they exist. Still, you can't do anything when the whole state machine is against you. A fully authoritarian approach to life and governance.
Continuation.
Well, yes.
I completely agree with Denis here. And by the way, here's a question I could ask Denis. Precisely to someone who understands modern Ukrainian society better, I really sincerely. From the very first days of the war, it's unclear why the focus was placed on the Ukrainian language and on such distancing from our shared history. I honestly thought that it would have been much more advantageous, both politically and culturally, to actually start claiming that you are Ukraine. It is the heir to that great Russian-speaking culture that both of our peoples worked on. It was surprising and strange to watch, and even more so to observe. In the 4th year of the war, such a rapid rejection, especially considering that Odessa is indeed part of Ukraine. It's just that all the stories connected with Russian culture itself and what it is, it looks like a kind of self-lobotomy, literally, like let's give up everything that your people have worked on for the last 500 years, literally. Well, that's just madness. It seems like madness to me from the outside. Maybe you can explain to me why this happened?
Have you talked about this on Radio Vera? I call it a gift to Putin. They gave him the Russian language and culture. Even those figures who have nothing to do with anti-Ukrainian sentiments or anything like that at all, it was simply a gift. It's a big mistake. It was done under pressure from certain clans. And who acts this way? Those who simply don't know any other way. They understood that this is the most primitive method, a primitive way of divide and conquer. Here are the enemies. We're all against them. No need to think. It's the same kind of governance. With Putin and here too, thinking isn't required.
Yes.
Because I had a really funny coincidence. Right now, I'm also forced to migrate. I'm in Brazil. And literally the same week when the Ukrainian government announced that, Bulgakov was the wrong kind of Ukrainian, and they started removing some commemorative plaques for him. I walk into a Brazilian bookstore, and there in big letters, in the colors of the Ukrainian flag, it says Ukrainian Writers Book Series. And Mikhail Bulgakov, of course, was featured there in this way. Not of course, but it's interesting. The difference between the export version of Ukrainian culture and the version of culture that's being promoted in the Ukrainian language right now?
Yes, it's a tragic comedy, of course.
And that's exactly what I wanted to ask Denis about. Denis said that he is, after all, a supporter of, let's say, naming names, specifically who, in fact, is to blame. Again, this is the story, how all of this will go down in history, how the primary causes will end up blurred, who invaded, how it all happened. Yes, or there will remain a kind of fog about it, that it was the Anglo-Saxons, that it was NATO, that it was them, that it was Europe, that it was America at first, and so on and so forth. So there will be complete confusion. But really, what did all this start over, and who is to blame? Who started it, who defended, and who protected themselves in the end? Or will it all get mixed up into a mess, and really people won't understand how it all began in the first place?
Well, in Ukraine, I don't believe in any fair or proper writing of textbooks there. You know what kind of textbooks they have today? I've seen them. Parents send them to me, the ones children study from in Ukraine. Every other page is like that. Volodymyr Zelensky is our great leader who didn't run away, and he's a good guy and all that. Putin is to blame for this war. No one disputes that. When I talk about last names, I'm strictly talking about who to direct hatred at, but the reasons for the war are not about a last name. One, of course, is Putin, but then there's a whole chain of events and mistakes, and it's very difficult to sort it all out. And here, right now, like in Ukraine, just for what I said, I've already been declared an enemy. You don't need to think or reflect. I always ask, who's to blame? Putin is to blame. He's the aggressor. Everyone knows it. But did Ukraine, or specifically Zelensky, do everything to prevent this war? No, he did nothing. Ukraine is a strong, prosperous country you shouldn't attack, but that's not the case. Why? Because that's how it was governed, including by Volodymyr Zelensky, who, let me remind you, has been president since 2019, not since 2022 when the war started. He did nothing. Moreover, he wouldn't even be president if it weren't for this war. By 2022, he would have been removed by a Maidan already. This was already being organized by several oligarchs in Ukraine, that's all. This war saved him. Politically, I've always said this and I repeat it today, but none of this justifies Putin. I always add this disclaimer since people in uniform are watching and trying to link statements to me that I never made. That's the problem, that today we can't just have a free and genuine discussion without controlling our words, and without a real discussion, you and I can, but in Ukraine and in Russia we can't. Exposing the untruth would be enough.
Can I ask you a question?
I'll add a couple of words because, first of all, I completely agree with what Denis said. I'd like to make one clarification and ask his opinion on this matter. Because, of course, Zelensky bears enormous responsibility as the person who, I'm not fond of the word provoked, but let's say didn't take the necessary steps to protect Ukraine from war. Here I agree. It seems to me that even greater responsibility lies with those Western leaders who gave him a false picture of the world. Because Zelensky himself, generally speaking, is a person without political experience who came to the presidential seat in Ukraine, and his life was not dedicated to politics. He didn't understand how diplomacy works. He didn't understand to what extent he could or couldn't trust foreign comrades, partners who promised him full support, promised him the world. And in the end, when the war begins, they literally don't fulfill the obligations they took upon themselves. So as a person, I don't absolve him of responsibility because he probably took on and played the historical role that he did. But at the same time, he was largely used by people who, as we agreed at the beginning of the broadcast, are truly the beneficiaries of the war. And there are a lot of such people in the West.
Well, that's true. It's foolish to deny it. And the well-known case with Boris Johnson, which everyone is discussing, was a classic example, but we can go back even further. That happened after the war had already started, or rather during the course of the war. And even earlier, there was the Russia-United States summit in Geneva, where Putin and Biden were present. And it was right after this summit that the CIA director at the time came to Ukraine, to Kiev, and gave a map showing how the attacks would unfold, meaning the war. After the summit, it became inevitable. And I ask myself, did Biden do everything he could to stop this war? Or maybe for the Biden-Obama clan, it was even beneficial. And I tend to lean more toward the second option. And this very thought, as someone who is completely pro-American, still makes me feel bad. Because this war should not have been allowed to happen, no matter how much of an idiot Zelensky was. The United States, represented by the Biden administration, could have prevented this war. And the Europeans, they're getting what they deserve now. In what sense have they already reached import substitution? Like Putin, in terms of technology and everything else, that's the only way I can describe it. So everything is bad in Europe today. Back then, they were just standing by and rubbing their hands, but everyone seems to forget that. Now, thanks only to United States Treasury Secretary Besant, he literally said what I've been saying. He said, you raised Putin, the dictator, and you keep feeding and financing this war. It's madness to pay Putin over 300 billion euros for energy resources during the war from the European Union side. And then to run around shouting at Zelensky, look at the enemy, but you were the ones who raised him. Without this Putin, there wouldn't be a war. And that's the Putin I wanted to talk about, that we need to figure out.
Yes, actually, Trump warned about this back in 2017. Trump literally warned the Europeans that they had become dependent on the Kremlin for energy. Can I ask one more question going back a bit? In light of all these events, have you reconsidered your attitude toward Euromaidan? I'm talking specifically about the second Maidan now. And in general, what is your attitude toward it? I just want to hear it firsthand before I ask my next question.
I was a participant in Euromaidan. But at that time, of course, I didn't understand what United States Agency for International Development was or who the globalists were. And to be honest, I wasn't there for that. I was there more against something, namely the Yanukovych regime, rather than for something. He opposed the pro-Russian agenda by refusing to sign the European Union Association Agreement. I knew how they were seizing businesses, and I knew all about this lawlessness. And I was there personally against that. But even in moments of discussion with other people, I understood how it would all end. For them, that's all. They only care about last names. I value Klitschko, Tyanibok, Poroshenko. Their minds were stuck on these names, but I understood who they were and that it wouldn't lead to anything good. And that's exactly how it turned out. I mean, the methods are clear and it's obvious. Billions from United States Agency for International Development. Nuland herself admitted this recently. I almost feel embarrassed to say it because it's always called Russian propaganda. Nuland was used as an example. There were all those things, but in reality, what happened was terrible. I don't regret being there, but people like me were used by those who ended up on stage.
Yes, well, actually, I have exactly the same view of what happened, because I absolutely don't doubt that 90% of the people who went out to the square, they did it sincerely because they were irritated by corruption. They were disgusted by everything you listed about Yanukovych's government. But also, observing from the outside, you notice that in general, under European slogans, under, let's say, promises to move toward the West, several politicians came to power. Obviously, that's Yushchenko, then Poroshenko, who also came as an interim candidate, who at first promised closer ties with the West. But that's how I see it, not being an insider, but as a citizen of the Russian Federation looking from the outside. So when they came to power, being smarter people, or at least more experienced than Zelensky, did they literally realize what kind of danger they were bordering on? And is that why they changed their policy? What's happening behind closed doors in the offices? But I think Russia, the Kremlin, explained directly to the previous presidents of Ukraine that if this, and this happen, like what happened with Yanukovych back then this, and this will happen. And as United States Agency for International Development people, as one president was replaced by another as a result of street uprisings. As a result, a person ended up in the president's chair in Ukraine who was inexperienced enough not to take these signals seriously, so to speak, and this led to war. This is, let's say, in broad strokes, my picture of what has happened over the past years.
But don't forget that after Maidan, Poroshenko became president and Zelensky is the president of Maidan. That happened later, although people who don't know, Zelensky actually submitted documents to run for president in 2014. Many people don't know that. Later, he withdrew them.
No, on the contrary, I'm listening to you.
Look, Mikhail and all the viewers, Mikhail often says throughout this conversation that an inexperienced person came. There's another point of view here. Inexperienced in what sense? In the Ukrainian and likely Russian context, an experienced person usually means an experienced corrupt official. I think it's better if someone is inexperienced, but do they understand politics and have an ideology, concept, or worldview? Zelensky, without a doubt, didn't understand a thing, and I know this for sure firsthand. He saw running Ukraine as if it were running Kvartal 95, just like in Kvartal 95. Zelensky is a creative team, a kind of moral leader, without a doubt, who organizes everything around himself. But when we talk about the business side, that's other people. Legal services are other people. And in the end, everything was managed by other people. So he thought it would work the same way in Ukraine. As a result, our head of the security service of Ukraine, the main security service of the country, disappeared somewhere in the first days of the war. Today, such details about him are coming out in Ukraine that you just hold your head in disbelief. He hasn't even been questioned once, but I'm already getting into Ukraine's internal affairs, though I'm explaining for a wider audience. So it's not that simple here either. The problems actually run much deeper. Today in Ukraine, even a person with different views can't run for office, and that's our problem now, just like in Russia, where no one can run at all.
I want to...
Right now, it's just that when I said inexperienced, that's exactly what I meant. A person who in his life was hardly interested in politics until the moment he suddenly became president. Donald Trump actually had the same problem during his first presidential term. When he became president, he basically didn't understand what to do as president and accordingly didn't carry out a single clear reform during that presidential term. The second presidential term is understandably a bit more successful for Zelensky. Zelensky being a more successful dependent figure than Trump and let's say characteristically different. And finding himself in a situation of possible war, he made much more serious mistakes. That is, not in the sense that a person shouldn't have experience in the Ukrainian government. Experience in the Ukrainian government also means dealing with corruption, cover-ups, and everything you mentioned. But experience, at least in terms of political thinking, how politics works, what dangers exist there, and how predatory that environment is. He should have had that kind of understanding, and I don't think Zelensky had it at the time he became president.
Yes, I agree with that. Well, of course, it's obvious.
First of all, I want to remind you that we have a very interesting broadcast today. In my opinion, you're right to say that it's special. Mikhail Svetov, Denis Eliseevich, and that's why I suggest you subscribe to Misha Svetov's channel and Denis Eliseevich's channel, and Vera Radio Television, which organizes such meetings that, so to speak, make the soul rejoice. This is absolutely sincere, both towards Mikhail and towards Denis. I'll tell you now what different things people have written here. A lot of all sorts of things. Here's one of them. Denis, did you say that? They're writing here?
That there's no sound, but I think everything is fine. Everything's working. Friends, write in the chat, did the sound really disappear?
I think everything can be heard well. If not, let me know. Denis, you said that I allowed myself to say such a phrase. Did you say Eliseevich by accident? I'm pro-American. What kind of patriot of Ukraine is that if a person calls themselves pro-American? And the same question goes to Svetov. What kind of patriot of Russia is he if he, that sound that sometimes appears and now disappeared if he praises Trump? I mean Misha Svetov. But most importantly, if you're pro-American, how can you be a patriot of Ukraine, Denis?
Well, pro-American, also pro-Israeli, but above all pro-Ukrainian. I'm just showing the direction that I think if someone calls themselves that, well, that's another conversation, a different topic. I won't go on about myself. Yes, I'm pro-American, pro-Ukrainian, pro-Israeli. I can also say pro-European, but not in the sense of the current European Union leaders. It's about whether someone is part of Western civilization.
You are a person of Western civilization. Denis.
Yes.
I'm not sure where this sound is coming from, but it's definitely not us.
There might be a child crying a little in the background on my end, but it shouldn't be very loud.
If that's Kai, then he doesn't bother us at all. He just adds some pleasant emotions.
I actually understand what Denis is saying, but I would phrase it differently. Of course, I'm a Russian politician, and Russia is above all for me. I just see that the decisions the Kremlin is making today are destructive for Russia's future, for Russia's strategic development. And that's why I place my hopes on the decisions that Donald Trump might make in order to at least prevent the Kremlin from making some of these additional mistakes. On the contrary, my hope has been there for a long time. And who heard my lectures in 2016 when I was still working in Russia? I have always said that I believe Russia is getting a historic chance to actually offer some new civilizational alternative to the West, which is gradually slipping into senility and crisis. First and foremost, I was talking about Europe, of course. This applies to the United States to a lesser extent. And we can see that I was right, that indeed the political course of the modern European Union is not just a dead end, it is destructive for that Western civilization, of which I consider Russia a part, and of which I am sure Denis considers Ukraine a part. And what is literally dear to us on a civilizational level, and my pain, my sorrow, is that instead of offering this civilizational path, and I insist that in Russia there was both the cultural opportunity for this and in fact the economic base for it as well, because not everything that Putin did was destructive. But unfortunately this became unavailable after 2022 when Putin started the war. And yes, this is the most global, total missed opportunity for Russia, which I remember with tears in my eyes.
Mikhail, I'm curious, you said this was before 2022. I mean, Russia's civilizational path, right? The one you had some hopes for? No.
The hope was that maybe inside the Kremlin or within Russian society, some kind of new civilizational proposal would emerge. Because the West, obviously, yes, has cursed both its past and its present, and is striving to turn itself into a global Pakistan. I find this disgusting. I kind of wanted Russia to avoid this fate for itself, and I am not confident that it will avoid this fate. Because Putin is actually very similar to an ordinary European leader when it comes to domestic policy. He just managed to do some things earlier, some things.
And maybe back then things were different. Are you asking what signs I saw of this, let's say, new, truly civilizational development?
Honestly, I'm curious how Denis will react to this. Actually, I saw this in Putin's own propaganda aimed at the West.
I would like to...
For the Kremlin to match the image it gives to Europeans, the image it gives to Americans. Unfortunately, there is nothing in common between this propaganda and the reality on the ground I had. I reached out to Kirill Dmitriev on Twitter a few weeks ago when he invited Eva Vladingenbroek and Tommy Robinson to Russia to give lectures. Yes, with the thesis that, look, in Russia you can say things that you can't say in the West. I went to his comments and wrote, Kirill, I was the person who invited Tommy Robinson to Russia. In 2020 in St. Petersburg, he spoke in front of a huge audience that I gathered more than 1,000 people. It was one of the largest events that Tommy Robinson ever organized and gathered in his life. To be precise, I am the person who made this meeting happen and many others as well. Today, entry to Russia is not allowed because Russia has the same kind of censorship that exists in the United Kingdom. Even more so because in Russia, Twitter is already completely blocked. And he didn't get the expected answer? Of course, yes, but my point is that the Russia that Kirill Dmitriev is selling to Tommy Robinson, the Russia that Russia Today is selling to the American and European audience, that Russia is attractive. And it looked like an attempt to create, first of all, a new myth of Russia, and secondly, some kind of civilizational offer. But in the end, we see that modern Russia has nothing in common with this propaganda. And unfortunately, besides this propaganda machine, Russia also has nothing else to offer. It's a missed opportunity.
Denis, anything to add? Denis?
Do you agree that the Kremlin presents an appealing image to foreigners?
If I may, I'll answer this question more broadly. I'll address a broader question, including this one, but in a wider context. So, Europe, why am I so opposed to Europe in general? It's because of something similar to what Mikhail said. When they introduce censorship, when in Britain they break into apartments and search online storage, what message does that send to Putin and Zelensky? I'm more concerned about Ukraine, of course. Zelensky will always say, look, they're doing this in Britain, in the European Union, so why shouldn't we do it in Ukraine? I think Europe doesn't even realize it themselves. As for Putin, I won't even comment. Now, Epstein's lists are coming up, and Putin comes out and says, look at what's happening in the West. There are some completely insane Satanists and so on. Who did you hand the trump card to? Putin will use this to say, see what happens in the West. That doesn't happen here, even though I'm sure it does. About Tommy Robinson, Tucker Carlson, when he interviewed Putin. Then he went to a supermarket somewhere in Russia and said, look, my cart is full and it's 2 or 3 times cheaper. Look at how clean the subway is in Moscow. Compare it to the New York subway. Tommy Robinson, I also left a comment for Tommy Robinson recently about this when he was saying that in Russia you can speak out, but in Britain you can't. This is such a mistake. It causes so much harm to Western civilization as well. I have a lot of respect for Tommy Robinson, but this is extremely harmful because he can say this as a British citizen. He left, it doesn't affect him. If Sveta were in Russia and Eliseevich in Ukraine, we wouldn't be here now. This happened, which is exactly why things are as they are. It's a disorientation of society. Mikhail knows Russia deeply. I know Ukraine. Together, we know the post-Soviet Union, how everything works. It's a complicated region. A naive European might see all this and think maybe things are really bad in Russia, or perhaps Zelensky truly is the leader of the free world in Ukraine. Here I want to say, in my opinion, the deepest reason. Oleg Tinkov, I think, gave an interview to Gordieva not long ago, and they talked about his children, whether they would return to Russia. He said, I gathered them and said, never. It will be 300% profitability, 500%, never. As long as the KGB is in charge there, as long as all of this exists, and I'm sure that in Russia, all the blame lies with this KGB management. To answer Mikhail's question directly, is this an attractive picture for the West? Well, maybe in some aspects, but as long as the KGB is in charge, I can't even take it seriously.
No, I'm only referring to the image used in propaganda, and I'm intentionally taking it out of context.
That propaganda is selling, yes, just by the image. It's part of Western civilization. If you listen to Tucker Carlson in Moscow, it's just like a candy, not a country.
And to add, I completely agree with everything Denis said again. I just want to add a nuance that besides the fact that this allows Vladimir Putin and Zelensky to raise the question, how are we any different? Are they any different from Western leaders? This, among other things, poisons the idea of an alternative, because with what? Yes, this is what the West brings to Russian society when it offers its own path. This is what the West brought to the Soviet person. It's clear, yes, Brezhnev, who was it? Khrushchev comes. No, yes, Brezhnev comes to an American supermarket. Yes, says this can't be real, thinks they've brought him to some kind of set where movies are filmed. This is the offer, yes, jeans, chewing gum, well, everything, only freedom of speech, culture. It's clear what the Americans, what Reagan, so to speak, addressed to the Soviet person. But what is Ursula von der Leyen addressing to the Russian person with today? With what? Boris Johnson addresses the citizens of Russia with promises like, hey guys, let's have your subway be as filthy as in London, and let's have Pakistanis assault every seventh child in some provincial town. And let's have people imprisoned for saying that it's not shameful to be Russian, and so on and so on and so on. This is the offer the West is making to Russian society today. If that's what it looks like, and that's exactly how it looks today, then why the hell would anyone need this Western choice at all? And of course, this becomes a huge trump card in the hands of Vladimir Putin, and it's a huge trump card in the hands of any dictator, absolutely. Because the alternative really is monstrous. It really is very bad.
I have a question, Denis. You mentioned that when Tinkoff gathered his children and told them never, well, as long as the current regime is in power, they shouldn't go back. There's no need to return.
Not the government, he clarified. The KGB in general, when the KGB runs the country, regardless of who represents it. He says, I will die, Putin will die, but never go back there because the KGB won't allow anything anyway. In the end, you'll still be robbed, killed, or imprisoned. That was the implication.
Basically, you answered the question I was about to ask. Because let's take the 1970s when Soviet Jews were leaving the Soviet Union. They weren't leaving Russia or Ukraine. They were leaving the Soviet Union because it was impossible for Jews to live there. Regardless, the anti-Semites who, so to speak, dominated both on an everyday level, when they would say, oh, well, that's just everyday anti-Semitism, that's not the state. What difference does it make? It was there, it still is, and so am I. Sadly, I think it will keep existing. But back then, people were leaving too, and they were leaving because of Soviet people or Soviet authorities. There was no Russia or Ukraine at that time. How would you comment on that?
Let's say Soviet authorities, not Soviet people.
I think, of course, definitely, Misha, you corrected me correctly. It's from the Soviet authorities. I just said that this Soviet authority extended to Soviet people who accepted it and used it against those Jews who were leaving. Isn't that right?
And who among us is this about? That's probably the question.
To Denis Stanseva. So tell me, please, because I understand this. Maybe you didn't experience that time when it happened.
No, of course I didn't experience it. I was born at the end of 87. Well, of course I agree with you. In some ways that's true.
And that's how it was back then.
Well, for my part, I'll say that in reality, people are very inert. This seems like part of toxic propaganda that was instilled in us, and honestly, I only got rid of it a few years ago, later than I would have liked. The idea that society is a subject in making political decisions, that people can take to the streets like people did on Maidan, and that their will would be carried out. Unfortunately, the crowd is almost always, in fact, I would say always, a tool of manipulation by a well-organized small group of people. And if we talk about how Soviet society influenced Soviet people, why did I make such a distinction? This distinction is fundamental because when Soviet power vanished, so did the Soviet person. And suddenly, it turned out that in 1988, everyone dreamed of becoming Komsomol members, Oktyabriata and pioneers, but by 1991, everyone wanted to be bandits and accordingly entrepreneurs. What changed? Did people change? No, the people were the same, the power changed, and people just went along, literally like in that meme about the wolf, like, look at my powerful paws. That's how people acted. They are led, and as much as it may sound like criticism, all people are led, whether in Europe, Ukraine, Russia, or the United States. It's a human trait, which is why such a great responsibility lies with those who take on a leadership role.
Yes, Mish, but who is a Soviet person? A Soviet person is a Russian, a Ukrainian, a Belarusian, a Moldovan. It's all a Soviet person.
A Soviet person is all the citizens of the Soviet Union at the time of its collapse, so we were all Soviet people.
But yes.
Some people have their own individual identity, but you also need to understand, first of all, what kind of people go into politics, and secondly, how rare this trait is. Because an individual can be divergent, meaning he can go against the crowd, he can go against the current. Such a person can be a leader, but such a person will never be the majority, because a majority with these qualities simply cannot form. because divergent people have a very hard time getting along with each other. That's why there are so many divergent people in politics, and it's their responsibility to try to lead people who are much more compromising, much more willing to follow, and in fact, much less interested in politics. Because the idea that the whole country will rise up as one to defend its freedom, they will rise up behind someone like Napoleon, they will follow someone. But if there is no Napoleon, then all those same people will fall apart and become nobody, just like any historical figure. This story repeats itself. There was Genghis Khan, yes, who united the nomadic peoples around him, and then Genghis Khan was gone. And all of that turned into modern Mongolia, where basically there is no center, no leader, nothing. That's why so much depends on leaders.
Alexander, if you don't mind, I'd like to discuss this further. It's more complex than it seems. You mentioned the Soviet person, but you know, there's an even more dangerous type, a mutant, a mutated Sovok, a mutated communism.
What does that mean?
Let me give you an example from Ukraine. In Russia, I see it differently. I don't know the internal situation very well, but I can see it from the comments. In my opinion, the Soviet person, of course, had a lot of flaws. I'm anti-Soviet myself, but I don't think there was as much malice toward each other. People were kinder back then. Now, when I join some channels' broadcasts, people wish death upon me, my fellow countrymen, and my country. The same thing is happening in Ukraine as well. They also easily brainwashed 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds. They just as easily created a personality cult around Zelensky. The only difference is that now all of this uses modern technology. And now in Ukraine, people aged 20 to 25, often with communist or socialist views, are quite aggressive.
Sure. I also agree with Denis, and I just want to add that this isn't something unique to people living in Ukraine or Russia. It's a trait of any person. And we see that people with exactly the same views suddenly appear in the United States and start advocating basically for things like nationalization. They elect Mamdani as the mayor of New York. So this is a type, it's universal. Why does this happen? And here Denis should understand me as a libertarian, because in reality, there are a huge number of economic incentives that make people become like this. And the government deliberately, sometimes out of inertia, sets things up so that the number of such groups of people increases. Because let's all think about this together here on the air. If a person holds anti-communist, anti-socialist views, if a person is an individualist and tries to protect their culture, their way of life, they face enormous resistance. Take Tommy Robinson, for example. He is put in prison, his bank accounts are closed, he is declared an enemy of the people, and there is a massive media campaign against him trying to portray him as almost the second coming of Hitler. We see the same thing with Eva Vladingenbrock, whom we have already discussed today. The same thing happened with Donald Trump, who was also called Hitler, faced a huge number of criminal cases, and was accused of attempting a coup d'etat. In general, all the mortal sins were poured onto him in abundance. This is the kind of resistance faced by a person who tries to go against this system, and on the contrary, a person who submits to this system, who adapts to it. A compromising person, what does he get? He gets United States Agency for International Development money. He gets money from a huge number of foundations. Law enforcement agencies start investigating him with much less zeal, as we can see now in Minnesota, where there was some kind of oversight. Corruption on a colossal scale led to Somali orphanages stealing $18 billion from the budget, these so-called effective orphanages. And now this investigation is ongoing. But for decades, they made colossal amounts of money and paid back by giving part of that money to the election campaigns of socialist candidates, who in turn raised taxes in order to funnel even more money into such corrupt schemes. And this spiral, yes, it's a specific economic incentive. Why does it become profitable for people to act this way? If these people are influenced by different incentives, then the people themselves will turn out to be completely different. That's why the political system really shapes the character of the people, the character of a person, and the responsibility of an honest politician. Yes, the point is to break such a toxic system and replace it with a system that allows a person to reveal their best, not their worst qualities. That's a long answer, but I think...
That's a great explanation. As a libertarian, I completely understand and support it. It really explains everything very well. I can say why I have, how should I put it, such a categorical rejection, and I don't understand. When discussing Mikhail, myself, and our countries, we remain post-communist societies with People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs roots. In Ukraine, people are now starting to report on each other, while in Russia, this practice of writing denunciations has existed for a long time with people setting each other up. We've defined it for ourselves as waking up with People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs genes, but our ancestors, we experienced a little bit of that ourselves. Real communism, real communism. When you see an American standing at home with a $1,500 iPhone, wearing $200 Nike sneakers, subscribed to Netflix and everything else on YouTube and TikTok, making videos and talking about some kind of communism, it's laughable. I mean, if you put him in real communism for a month, it would be a good lesson for him. I thought we already had some kind of immunity, but now when I see what's happening with Ukraine, for ourselves, our generation is younger than 20, 25 years old, and how quickly they pick this up, and it all mutates into even worse forms and subtypes. This is something I can't fully explain to myself yet, even with the help of economics and United States Agency for International Development.
Not United States Agency for International Development, there are also internal incentives, including the fact that it seems to me this is actually a feature of universal suffrage, not of democracy in general, but specifically of universal suffrage, where indeed it turns out to be much easier to unite in order to vote for the redistribution of other people's resources than to earn your own. There is a libertarian book about this, which I'm sure Denis has read, Hans Hermann Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed. He describes in detail there, yes, Mikhail, the mechanism of how this works. In my opinion, universal suffrage inevitably leads to communism, and one of the main lies that was sold to Western people, to Western civilization, is that universal suffrage can have some other result. No, it cannot.
But I want to ask you, Denis, have you noticed if you take the generation of the 70s, yes, that's probably your parents, Mikhail's. These are people who experienced that life. I mean, Soviet people, but they are also still quite active and young, who lived through that time. It's a special type of people who can really compare then and now from their own experience. So if we talk about your audiences, about Mishin, about yours, Denis, is your audience those people or the ones in the middle?
My audience is from 25 to 65. There are a lot of older people, 55 plus and even 65 plus. In my metrics, in my social networks, I'm not represented well by younger people at all. There, the situation isn't good for those under 20 or even up to 25. I'll explain to you why. Because in Ukraine, well, the special services have completely won in this regard. They bought out the entertainment bloggers completely, like those TikTokers and streamers, and they pushed their agenda in there, the one they needed. They get paid about $50,000 to $100,000 a month. They get apartments, they get exemptions from mobilization, but they promote the agenda. And when you're fighting against that kind of funding and those kinds of resources alone, of course, it's tough. And of course, I admit at this point I lost, but we'll see what happens next. And regarding generations, we're in a unique situation overall. Look, my grandmother is alone. She lives in America. She survived the siege of Leningrad. So how is she supposed to look at the humanitarian catastrophe happening in Kyiv today? Russia is bombing Ukraine. When she went through what a Soviet person did on the second line, my family faced repressions. Stalin repressed one of our family members for anti-Soviet propaganda. And only after his death was he acquitted. And today, here I am in political exile in Ukraine with Russia bombing and causing a humanitarian catastrophe. Just look at the whole picture.
This is exactly what I was talking about. This was the Soviet Union, where just like now, people will write to me calling me all sorts of names, that it was one people. Today, everything is completely different and things are happening in a different way. And what is the attitude toward that Soviet people who once existed? And it's like it exists, but at the same time, it doesn't, according to Eliseevich, as they write, and according to Svetov. And then the rhetoric continues. Eliseevich and Svetov allow themselves to say such things. Well, here it's like they start bringing in all sorts of words or something else about their own countries, about their own peoples, because they took off. Well, obviously they left, went abroad, and so on.
Stop. I started broadcasting from Ukraine, from the city of Kiev, from my home. I had something to lose. I lost a lot. I didn't leave and started broadcasting. I started broadcasting in the city of Kiev, saying exactly the same things. All the videos are there on the channel. All the streams are there. This is a person who doesn't know anything, writing.
That's unbelievable. Well,
basically, it's the same story. I started political work in 2015, and as a result of my work, I lost a huge amount of money. I had a club in the center of Moscow in a huge historic building, which was literally taken away from me because I invited people to hold political events there. And now I am wanted. There is a criminal case against me, and I have been declared a foreign agent, so I am in forced exile. I would gladly return to Russia if I had the opportunity, but unfortunately that opportunity is closed to me.
Alexandra, does this also relate to this conversation?
Yes.
Of course. You see, just like the well-known Alexei Koncharenko recently gave a great speech, and not just one, he started speaking out actively. I don't know if you know him or not. He's a people's deputy, kind of an artist on his own. He was from Zelensky's party, entered parliament from Zelensky's party, Heoleros. He, showed Zelensky the middle finger in parliament, insulted him and all that, and he wasn't heard from for about a year. Today, he did a new performance in the Ukrainian parliament called Zelensky, a thief who should be arrested and removed from power. And people write to me, see, that's how it should be done while you're just sitting there, the same thing, you're just sitting somewhere. That's how people fight against the authorities. They're in Kiev with the status of a people's deputy, of course, under protection, of course, with funding. You understand how this works? This is what a person writes. Today, I'm telling you this, those very same mutants.
No, because there's no doubt about it. As for Misha Svetov, before we met, I definitely went and watched, on social media. And so when they write, these people, let's say Denis Eliseevich and Mikhail Svetov, have never worked, they've never done any hard labor. And, even when I don't even know, I just let it go, let it go, let it go. But there's a lot of it, Denis, there's a lot of it. And that's what's surprising.
They've never oiled a machine with machine oil.
You also have to understand that people measure work by how tired they are, literally. Yeah, for them, what's important isn't how effectively you achieve some goals, but how tired you got in the process. Unfortunately, that's also a kind of Soviet mentality. But speaking about the Soviet person, I also wanted to make a note that there is no such thing as a Soviet person as a single historical community, because the Soviet person of the 1930s, the Soviet person of the 1950s, and the Soviet person of the 1980s are all different Soviet people, and the Soviet Union itself was also very different at those times. And this is something that's also important not to lose sight of and not to forget, because there are different ways of reforming. So Denis and I, of course, lived through perestroika. We lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I'm actually interested in hearing Denis's opinion on this matter. But at the same time, I don't think that the scenario by which the dismantling of the Bolshevik regime took place in our countries is the optimal way. If you look at China today, especially considering what's happening in Russia and what's happening in Ukraine right now, it went through basically the same period, let's say, at a less destructive cost and with much greater success than what eventually happened in our countries. That's why we shouldn't overlook these things. Children shouldn't be blamed for their parents' crimes, because in any case, we will have to work with the people, the history, and the country that we inherit, rather than trying to build yet another new world in its place, like the Bolsheviks did. And we know how all of that ended.
Guys, I have a question for both of you, one at a time. How do we write it? The world depends on Trump. Is that a strength or a weakness of diplomacy? M.I.
Well, that's probably Trump's strength and the strength of the United States, which has achieved a unique civilizational success. My issue with Donald Trump is that he doesn't seem to realize his own strength. Maybe it's less about him and more about his team, who should be telling him this. That he doesn't realize, first of all, his own significance, doesn't realize his strength, and is not ready to use it even on his own domestic stage. Because after Trump, if the American system is not somehow protected by him, in my opinion, the United States is facing a catastrophe. Literally, because we can already see what's happening in the States where the Democrats are coming to power, and after 2 terms of Trump's presidency, the left-wing Democrats definitely won't forgive Americans for that.
Denis?
What to respond to?
The same question for you that was for Mikhail.
About the role, about Trump, is his strength the strength of the United States, or is it kind of a vulnerability in international relations?
Well, what kind of vulnerability can there even be here, you see, when people even ask such a question? In my opinion, it's a complete misunderstanding of what's happening, a lack of awareness of what's going on. Yes, who today, besides Trump, wants peace and can actually make it happen? Name me such a person. There was someone who spoke out not long ago from Italy. Some politician, someone who can now, so to speak, take on Russia, force Putin to do something, do everything, or directly enter into war with Russia. Please do it. Solve the issue differently. No, only Trump can do this. Of course, Trump is a force. If today it wasn't President Trump, but Kamala Harris. I often ask this question on my broadcasts. I'm afraid to imagine what it would be like now. That would have been a nightmare.
And a question for Mikhail. Mikhail, if the United States is the main enemy, why does Russia continue to negotiate with Washington?
Well, as far as I know, even in Russia, the United States is not currently declared the main enemy. They are declared the main competitor, while the European Union and accordingly the European Commission are declared the enemy. So pay attention to Kremlin propaganda. It has changed a little.
Another question for Mikhail. Is there a future for the relationship between the Russian Federation and the United States?
I really hope so, and in general, I associate reforms in Russia with the fact that we will succeed. It seems to me that Russia has a lot in common with the United States, the scale of the country, and the fact that Russia can claim some kind of new frontier. I hope that Russia will learn from the success story of the United States and will be able to replicate it, but unfortunately, that is not happening at all yet.
And if there is no future in the relationship, what is left then? A Cold War, and Russia demands security, but who guarantees the security of Russia's neighbors?
You see, international politics has a tendency to change, and the sides that are enemies today can easily become allies tomorrow. That's exactly what happened in World War II, which we discussed today. Remember, the Soviet Union began the war on a different side than it ended. Therefore, even the threats that are seen today as clear-cut, like Russia being in a civilizational conflict with China, with Europe, or in competition with the United States, history can easily revise this, can easily change it. Because we don't know how China will behave tomorrow. We don't know how our Middle Eastern neighbors will act tomorrow, who in general also see and identify weakness very well and will definitely take advantage of that weakness. And there will be alliances that we can't even imagine today.
Thank you, Miss Denis. I have a question for you. Ask Denis. Why did the General Staff of Ukraine decide to disband the International Legion right now?
I have no idea. I read about it. I think Le Monde wrote that it was disbanded secretly. It was news to me too, but I only have some political thoughts about it, which are related to the end of the war.
The question is, was it due to military necessity or politics? If you know.
I don't know, but I think it's a political decision. I suppose.
Does that mean that relying on foreign volunteers didn't pay off?
No, you can't say that, regardless of whether it paid off. In the state Ukraine was in when it entered the war, all of this was done incorrectly. I know how these legions were formed. Now, we're just going to get off topic.
Here's another question. How widespread was foreign participation in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and what was their actual role?
It wasn't as widespread as Russian propaganda presents it, because they talk as if half of the Ukrainian armed forces are foreigners, but no, it's actually a small number.
Yes, that's obvious. I fully agree with Denis too. And it's interesting that these foreign legions were actually beneficial for the propaganda of all sides, because it was beneficial for Russia, for the Kremlin to present this as a war against NATO. So look, Europe and the whole world are fighting against the Russian army. For Ukraine, it was also beneficial to present it this way. Like, look, Europeans understand that we are involved in an existential war, and they came to help us. Volunteers are going to Ukraine to fight against these terrible orcs, as they are called in Ukrainian propaganda, who are attacking from the east. And for Europeans, accordingly, it was beneficial to show it this way, demonstratively, like, look, we are ready to support you even with manpower. But in the end, of course, the actual role of these foreign legions was minimal.
Regarding Telegram, a question for both of you. Is the slowdown of Telegram actually a partial blockade, or is it just a signal to the market and society for now?
But it was slowed down?
Yes.
Yes, Mikhail, yes.
It was slowed down. Today, let me answer. First, simply because I participated in rallies, organized rallies in support of Telegram when it was still possible in 2016, 2017, and 2018. Unfortunately, first of all, this is an attempt to push people further into messengers. Max, I'm sure this attempt will be successful. It will just take some time because Max is becoming an indispensable tool for life in Russia. Work with various bureaucratic agencies is tied to it. Communication with teachers, communication with officials is tied to it. That's why I'm sure the Kremlin initiative will succeed. Soon everyone will have to install the Max Messenger. As for the blocking of Telegram, unfortunately, my forecast about this is also very grim. The Kremlin now has all the necessary tools to isolate the Russian internet from the external internet. The infrastructure is almost completely ready for this. Maybe it won't take such total forms as it does in China. However, the switch itself already exists. We've seen that entire regions are disconnected from the internet when necessary, and this is justified by the war. We understand Kamchatka was disconnected from the internet not due to the war, but because the infrastructure was being tested. Firstly and secondly, the gradual cutting off of Russian society from any uncensored external information. Russian society today has no tools to resist this, so the only hope is that with Putin's departure, all these practices will somehow be reconsidered.
But today, Telegram is Russia's main news source, or rather no.
Telegram is not only the main source of news for Russia, it's actually also a platform favored by the genuine patriotic sector, including the unpaid patriotic sector. People who supported the war, people who support the Kremlin, who publicly curse Ukraine, curse the West, consider it their intellectual platform, are also present there. Yegor Kolmogorov, the Russian community, communicate on Telegram, and soldiers at the front also communicate on Telegram. Because these are secure messengers, contrary to what propaganda says, and they really are opaque to international intelligence agencies. And today the Kremlin is getting rid of this because even patriots are a problem for the Kremlin. The Kremlin basically hates any grassroots initiative, even if that initiative supports it. It will be destroyed as soon as the grassroots element and the need for it disappear. My prediction is that right now in some presidential administration in the Kremlin offices, they are looking at the grassroots organizations that have appeared during the war. Because indeed, a lot has been taken on by volunteers, both the humanitarian aid delivered to the border regions and the sending of drones. In the first years, it was almost entirely sustained by private initiative and accordingly the weaving of camouflage nets. And these quasi-military organizations like the Russian community that emerged, which is now incredibly influential in Russia and has a network of offices that surpasses what Navalny once had, I'm 100% sure that the Kremlin sees this as a serious threat, as a serious problem for itself. Because here, Denis is familiar with this again as someone who, in general, grew up in a similar society. The Kremlin, the special services, they always see grassroots initiatives as a problem, no matter what they are about. And it will be suppressed, and that's why Telegram is being destroyed, because without Telegram, such initiatives are impossible.
We
just got a phone call.
will be a little late, if you guys don't mind. Today, Good Morning is on air.
Hello? What's your name?
Hello, my name is Fyodor.
Please.
I live in the city of Oakville, which Mikhail Svetov probably knows from his experience living in Canada. I actually have a question for Mikhail Svetov. It's a bit off topic, so you can answer it however you like. I suppose I have a question for Mikhail Svetov regarding civil society. So we see what has happened recently. I watched Mikhail's broadcast on the live train, and to Mikhail, a little bit. He doesn't like to call the things that have been happening until recently and probably are still happening in America acts of civil society. He doesn't like to call them protests, and so I have a question. Mikhail Svetov and his media, in fact, strongly supported the Canadian truckers' protests for a long time, which were much more distant, adaptive, and caused much more damage. In the end, despite all his rhetoric, no one was imprisoned for those protests. 2 organizers were placed under house arrest.
The question is,
here's my question. Why is it that when civil society acts quite aggressively in Canada, it's considered civil society? But when civil society tries to exist rather peacefully in the United States, with Mikhail Svetov, for example, we see this kind of distinction. Over there, it's not considered civil society. It's all methodically planned out. But here in Canada, even though there have been investigations showing an American financial trail in the quarantine processes, all of this is considered a genuine surge of civil society.
Thank you. And accordingly?
There were more protests there.
Thank you, yes.
well, accordingly, the answer, in my opinion, is obvious. Because when rallies took place in Canada, martial law was imposed against them. And the entire political elite united to stop these protests. Whereas in the United States, we see that nothing like that is happening. A huge part of the political establishment is not just supporting the protesters, but is actually part of those organizing the protests. I completely disagree with how you put it and the claim of destructiveness. Because the protest that took place in Canada, the Freedom Convoy, was first of all peaceful and aimed at preventing the repressive policies that Justin Trudeau was carrying out at the time. While people who take to the streets and obstruct work of the deportation police aim to prevent the enforcement of American law and obstruct the work of the police. So the difference, in my opinion, is obvious. First of all, it is different because there was not a single serious political force in Canada on the side of the truckers. Whereas in the United States, we see that these protesters are organized by the Democratic Party. But at the same time, I also do not doubt that a huge number of people, the majority, 90%, are participating in these protests voluntarily and consciously, and no one is paying them for it. I do not question that. And overall, of course, they are part of civil society, just a destructive part. When we talk about civil society, we don't necessarily mean something good. Civil society can also be destructive.
Yes, but when that caller Fedor was talking about whether it was right or wrong, I was giving my own assessment of what was happening in Canada. But I am also Canadian. I also live in this country. I absolutely agree with everything you said, Fedor. Because that was exactly a demonstration of the strength of this society, its independence, and the democracy that, in a good sense, exists in Canada, and I hope will continue to exist. I want to get back to the television channel. Denis, this question is for you. Ask Denis, how many generations are you and everything about Telegram and so on? How realistic is it to make Telegram cooperate with the authorities, and why slow it down instead of blocking it completely?
Slowing it down, I don't know. Mikhail already explained everything better than I could. In general, I can tell you about Telegram. When Mikhail was talking about Russia and how all this works from the government side, I was listening to it in horror. How is the same thing happening in Ukraine? I could never have thought that way. We have the head of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, or rather the head of the Verkhovna Rada Committee on Freedom of Speech, constantly speaking on behalf of Zelensky's party. By the way, ban Telegram, ban Telegram. Everyone here is calling to ban Telegram. At the same time, the authorities themselves are investing millions of dollars into it. And just so you understand, in the Ukrainian political Telegram market, if we're talking about buying and selling a channel, they pay from $3 to $5 per subscriber when buying a political Telegram channel. That's the situation. It's terrible. And I honestly have no words when things like this are happening in my country. It's unbelievable. To ban a social network, but Zelensky recently said that's what the enemies do. We won't do that.
I want to ask you guys about another topic that isn't related to Telegram or what you were talking about. And this will be half joking, half serious. There was an interview recently, Misha. I'm sure you saw it, and I think Denis did too. Well, Misha definitely saw it. This one. Ksenia Sobchak and Katya Gordon.
Unexpectedly.
Well, where is that woman, that Gordon, I actually don't know her, was saying that Israel is a fascist state? Why did she even come to this meeting with Shevchenko? I really didn't understand that at all. So is he her assistant, or is he her aide, or did he come to support her, or was she afraid of Ksenia Sobchak? I want to ask.
Yeah, did she bring him as help? Naturally, because Shevchenko is a competent speaker, and Katya Gordon... Honestly, I haven't watched that interview. Now you've got me intrigued. Katya Gordon was generally not known for her intelligence.
But for her beauty instead.
There's also a symbiosis.
But you know what surprised me, Misha, Denis? When Ksenia Sobchak started asking her, why do you call Israel a fascist state? She said, I'm not against Jews, I'm against Zionists. But then Sobchak started digging further and asked, why are Zionists fascists? And do you even know what Zionism is? It would have been incredibly funny if it weren't so sad. But she started mumbling something, and then Sobchak began reading something to her from somewhere, like, is it okay if...
Can I argue with you and with Sobchak right now? Because actually, the concept of fascism itself has already been reinterpreted in popular language as basically an attempt to protect the interests of your own group and to prioritize your group's interests over others. Today, leftist propaganda literally calls this fascism. By that definition, Israel fits, but that's not a criticism, it's actually positive. I would like Russia to fit this definition, and I'm sure Denis would like Ukraine to fit this definition as well. And until recently, European countries and the United States also fit this interest. The slogan America First means that the interests of the United States should be the top priority for the government of this country. The Democrats argue with this because they are building a world where there is nowhere to run, a world without borders.
Denis, what is your comment on what Misha just said?
I have only one comment. I want to watch this interview. I'm intrigued too. I haven't seen it. I completely understand what you mean about Zionism. I'll watch it and then share my opinion.
You see, when Sobchak started reading to her that Zionism is a socio-political movement whose goal is to bring all Jews back to Israel and settle them there, and then she asked her, so where is fascism in that? There was complete misunderstanding. Even Shevchenko couldn't help.
No, but why? And would it be considered fascism if, for example, some British organization set itself the goal of returning all Pakistanis to Pakistan?
One more thing. Well, yes, I don't know what to say to that, Misha. Misha, when we had an interview recently, I asked Denis about this. These are debates, yes, Leon Weinstein and Alexander Goldford. Well, of course, you know who Goldford is and who he is. But when I was listening to them, when Goldford was talking, not Weinstein.
But Weinstein is not Weinstein.
No, not Weinstein. It was Leon. It was Weinstein. Oh, okay. So it wasn't Victor Weinstein, yes. And so when these debates were happening, well, Leon Weinstein was very active and Goldford was less so. But Goldford is a friend. The one we all don't like, Misha. Remind me, please, Soros. We all don't like Soros.
He's kind of a friend of Soros.
And also, Berezovsky, I want to ask, if you were given such a candidate for debates, or if Misha or Denis were, how would you guys feel about that?
I need to learn about his positions first, but if he's supporting Soros, that's worth discussing. Debates aside, there's definitely something to talk about. What makes Soros interesting as a figure? What's interesting is that this is a person who realized that investing in politics is more profitable than investing in business, more profitable than anything else, because by investing in politics, you can change the world. And the complaints about Soros, they always sound very toothless, even though his role is extremely destructive, and I really hate what he's doing with world politics. But what are the complaints, really? Why did Soros invest and everyone else didn't? If Soros had some kind of alternative, then his project of turning the Western world upside down would have been unaffordable for him. But only Soros was involved in investments. And in the end, yes, as they say, if you don't want to support your own politicians, you'll end up paying those politicians who are supported by others. That's how it turned out.
Yeah.
Who doesn't like supporting their own politicians? Denis, your comment on this?
I need to get familiar with the activities too, especially if we're talking about Soros, since my country has been occupied by Soros for a long time, which is a particularly painful topic for me. Well, Mikhail, when he talks about Soros, we shouldn't forget, it's not just about being a genius or investing in politics, but NGOs. We need to talk about NGOs. That's not exactly an investment. I don't even know what to call it. Maybe a brilliant scheme. Because of the tax system, yeah.
An investment in a scheme?
Yeah, I totally agree with that wording.
Lastly, here's what I suggest. Your comment about today's joint broadcast, Denis, you go first, and then you, Misha. Or maybe a question for Mikhail or a question for Denis. Just so we can wrap up this beautiful, pleasant, and worthy tandem today. I've already received an incredible number of messages, never this many compliments before. What a wonderful idea, how great it turned out, how nice that they both came. It's so good that they both came. Denis, no.
Of course it's good, even though there are hardly any situations where a Russian citizen and a Ukrainian citizen are on the same broadcast and they're not arguing, not insulting each other, or not just discussing Putin together, but actually having some kind of constructive discussion. You just won't see that. And this is a problem for both Russia and Ukraine. Freedom of speech is the foundation of democracy. If it doesn't exist, there's nothing more to talk about. There is democracy in this broadcast. So if it existed and both countries were democratic, first of all, we wouldn't be at war. And secondly, we would definitely have reached an agreement. If there were any problems or disagreements, we would resolve them just like we do in this broadcast, for example.
Misha.
Yes, I agree, and I'm glad that this broadcast took place, and I'm glad that we resolved some misunderstanding that arose between us, so I enjoyed it. Thank you, Denis, for coming. I was glad to talk.
Where are the compliments? Radio Vera, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, Radio Vera always compliments.
Of course, of course. Thank you very much, Alexandra, for organizing this. It was wonderful. Always very glad.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Misha. Thank you, Denis. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. All right, bye.